Welcome to the Golden Age, not just of Kush, but arguably of Egypt itself. For the next 75 years, Nubian pharaohs would rule one of the most powerful empires in the ancient world, and they did it so well that they basically out-Egypted the Egyptians. Let's talk about the dynasty that Pi established. After Pi came Shabako, then Shabitko, and finally Taharko, and each of these guys brought something incredible to the table. But before we dive into individual achievements, let me blow your mind with what they accomplished collectively. These Nubian pharaohs launched what historians call the Nubian Renaissance in Egypt. During their rule, Egypt experienced a cultural and architectural revival that it hadn't seen in centuries. They weren't just maintaining Egyptian traditions, they were elevating them to heights that native Egyptian pharaohs hadn't reached in generations. Let's start with Shabako, who took over after Pi. This guy looked at Egypt and basically said, "You know what this place needs? A return to its roots." He launched massive restoration projects on ancient temples that had been neglected during Egypt's period of civil wars. But he didn't just restore them, he improved them, adding new chambers, updating artwork, and ensuring that religious ceremonies could be conducted with a level of grandeur that Egypt hadn't seen since the height of the New Kingdom. But it was under Taharko that Nubian rule truly reached its peak. This wasn't just a king with military might, this was a visionary ruler who understood legacy. During his 26-year reign, Taharko launched one of the most ambitious building programs in all of Egyptian history. He didn't just build more than most pharaohs, he redefined what royal construction looked like. From the heart of Nubia to the temples of northern Egypt, Taharko left his mark. Massive temple complexes, restorations of sacred sites, monuments that reached skyward as if to touch the gods. These weren't just statements of power, they were acts of devotion, unity, cultural fusion. What makes Taharko's work stand out even more is the artistry. The monuments of the 25th dynasty showcase a stunning blend. Egyptian tradition fused with Nubian identity. You'll see pharaohs carved in classic poses, yes, but with unmistakably African features. Wearing the regalia of Nubia, they didn't copy Egypt, they honored it, while proudly inserting their own heritage into the story. And then there was religion. The Nubian pharaohs didn't just continue Egypt's religious traditions, they brought them back to life. They revived ancient rituals, reinstated long-forgotten festivals, and reintroduced pyramid building for their own burials, something Egypt hadn't seen in over 500 years. Taharko wasn't just ruling a kingdom, he was shaping a renaissance. And in doing so, he reminded the ancient world that the power of Nubia was not just military, it was spiritual, cultural, and enduring. Now here's where things really take a turn, because the Nubian pharaohs weren't just respected in their own lands. They were recognized across the ancient world. In particular, wasn't some obscure African king ruling in isolation. No, he was a world figure. He's even mentioned in the Bible. When the Assyrian Empire, the superpower of the time, was threatening Jerusalem, the Israelites didn't call on Egypt. They looked south to Taharko, to a Nubian king. They saw him as their potential savior. Against the most feared military machine of the age, that's the level of influence we're talking about. Economically, this was a golden age, literally. The wealth of Nubian gold, combined with Egypt's fertile agriculture and expanded trade networks, created a booming economy. Even the Assyrians, their future enemies, wrote about the immense riches of Taharko's court. But it wasn't all. Going into palaces and luxuries, the archaeological evidence shows investments in public infrastructure, temple restoration, and a well-equipped military. But maybe the most remarkable achievement of all was how they governed. The 25th dynasty didn't erase Nubian identity to rule Egypt, they embraced both cultures. They ruled from dual capitals, Napata in Nubia and Memphis in Egypt. They wore the double crown, yes, but they carried two traditions with them, weaving them into a single, powerful legacy. For nearly a century, these so-called Black Pharaohs brought unity, peace, cultural revival, and global prestige to a land that had been fragmented and fading. They didn't just restore Egypt, they elevated it. But no golden age lasts forever, and on the eastern horizon, storm clouds were gathering. The Assyrians were advancing, and this time they were bringing iron weapons and an empire-sized appetite for conquest. Just when the Nubian pharaohs seemed to have everything under control, they collided with a force unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. the Assyrian Empire. But the Assyrians weren't easily discouraged. Assyria had become a ruthless military superpower. These weren't just ambitious kings with big armies, they had revolutionized warfare. Their iron weapons were far more durable and deadly than the bronze arms used by most other powers. Iron swords and spears held a brutal edge literally and figuratively over bronze. But the danger went beyond metallurgy. The Assyrians were master tacticians. They developed large, organized armies with divisions for infantry, cavalry, and siege engineers. Their siege warfare was terrifying, battering rams with iron tips, mobile towers, coordinated assaults on city walls. They didn't just fight battles, they dismantled cities. So when Egypt, under Nubian rule, came into their sights, the threat was existential. The first major clash came in 671 BCE, when Assyrian king Esarhaddon invaded Egypt. Taharqa, now the reigning pharaoh, tried to resist. But the Assyrian advance was swift and devastating. Memphis fell. Taharqa was forced to retreat south back toward Nubia. For a moment, it seemed the 25th dynasty had lost everything. But Taharqa wasn't done. He regrouped, rallied his forces, and in a stunning turn of events, retook Memphis. This counterattack shook Assyrian confidence and proved that the Kushites could still fight back even against a juggernaut. But the Assyrians weren't easily discouraged. In 667 and again in 663 BCE, Esarhaddon's son Nashir-Baniplanch renewed invasions. This time, the Assyrians were prepared. They advanced deeper into Egypt. They struck a devastating blow. They captured and sacked Thebes. Now, Thebes wasn't just any city. It was the spiritual heart of Egypt, a center of religious life for over 1,000 years. The destruction of Thebes wasn't just military, it was psychological. Assyrian records boast about the pillaging of its temples and the sheer amount of treasure taken. It marked the symbolic end of Nubian rule over Egypt. But Taharqa, however, the strategist, understood the deeper reality. He didn't waste his remaining strength on a hopeless defense. He withdrew to Nubia, protecting his homeland, his people, and the legacy of Kush. And that decision proved wise. The Assyrians, stretched thin across their vast empire, never pushed further south. Nubia remained independent. What this moment showed was that the Kingdom of Kush was more than its conquest of Egypt. Its strength came from its own deep foundations, its gold mines, its trade networks, religious traditions, and cultural resilience. Losing Egypt was a blow, yes, but it wasn't the end. Not even close. In fact, it was the beginning of a new chapter. Because while the 25th dynasty ended in Egypt, the story of Kush was far from over. Here's where the Kingdom of Kush does something most fallen empires never manage. They reinvent themselves and come back even stronger. After losing Egypt to the Assyrians, the Kushites didn't fade into history. They adapted. Around the 6th century BCE, Kushite rulers made a bold strategic decision. They moved their capital south, from Napata to Meroë. And this wasn't just a change of scenery. It was the beginning of a cultural and economic transformation. Let me paint the picture. Meroë became something rare in the ancient world, an industrial city. Archaeologists have uncovered enormous slag heaps around the site, evidence of large-scale iron smelting operations. This wasn't your neighborhood blacksmith. It was mass production of iron tools and weapons. Fueled by the region's abundance of hardwood for charcoal and access to iron ore, the sheer scale of production suggests Kush became a major ironworking hub long before much of the world had caught up. But this industrial shift also came with economic brilliance. Meroë's location placed the kingdom at the crossroads of Trans-Saharan, Nile Valley, and Red Sea trade routes. The Kushites became vital intermediaries in the movement of gold, ivory, incense, exotic animals, textiles, goods desired by the Mediterranean world. Roman merchants and officials sought African luxuries, but they couldn't easily reach the interior. Kush bridged that gap and profited handsomely from it. Even more fascinating, this era saw the rise of a new writing system. The Kushites began using the Meroë script, a distinctive alphabet derived in part from Egyptian hieroglyphs, but entirely unique. While scholars still haven't fully deciphered the language, the creation of this script marks something powerful. A civilization confident enough to express its identity in its own terms. Culturally, Meroë was a melting pot. Art from this period reflects an incredible synthesis: Egyptian traditions, Nubian aesthetics, and subtle influences from Greek, Roman, and even Indian contexts. This wasn't mimicry, it was adaptation. They created a cosmopolitan African civilization that maintained its distinct character while absorbing what was useful from the wider world. What's even more impressive? They did all this while staying independent, as Rome, Persia, and other empires gobbled up territory across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. The Meroë kingdom stood firm. It wasn't just about having iron or trade routes. It was about resilience. It's about building systems that could endure. That included agriculture. The move to Meroë meant adjusting to a more arid climate. But the Kushites rose to the challenge. They developed innovative irrigation systems, including reservoirs and wells, to make the most of seasonal rains and river floods. These adaptations allowed them to sustain agricultural surpluses that fueled both population growth and long-distance trade. Even religion evolved. While they maintained Egyptian deities like Amun, they began to localize their religious practices. Temples from this period, like the ones at Naka and Musawara, Izus Frasho, a unique blend of Egyptian, Nubian, and entirely new Meroitic architectural styles. The rituals and gods may have had familiar names, but the way they were worshipped became increasingly distinctively Kushite. And then there's the longevity. The Meroë kingdom thrived for nearly 800 years. It's longer than the entire span of the Roman Empire. In a region prone to conquest, collapse, and chaos, Kush endured, not by dominating others, but by building a civilization that was adaptable, innovative, and self-reliant. All the while, Egypt, once the center of ancient power, was falling under foreign control, again and again. Persians, Greeks, Romans. But Kush had let go of empire and found something stronger: sustainability. And perhaps most intriguing of all, what made Meroë truly unique was the way they ruled. Because, as we'll see next, the political system of the Meroë kingdom was unlike anything else in the ancient world. Let's talk money, because understanding how the Kushites built and maintained their wealth over more than 1,000 years is absolutely key to understanding how they became such a powerful and enduring civilization. At the heart of their wealth was something every ancient power wanted: gold. But the Kushites weren't just sitting on a lucky gold deposit. They mastered large-scale gold extraction in ways that most ancient civilizations never came close to achieving. Archaeological surveys across Sudan have identified hundreds of ancient gold mines in former Kushite territory. And the scale, massive. These weren't small prospecting pits. They were full-blown mining operations involving thousands of workers. Sophisticated extraction techniques and ore processing sites capable of handling large volumes. What set them apart economically was vertical integration. They didn't just mine raw gold, they refined it, crafted it, and exported finished goods. The Kushites produced jewelry, ritual objects, and luxury items of such high quality that their craftsmanship rivaled that of Egypt, Greece, and Rome. Their gold work was renowned for both technical precision and stylistic innovation. But gold was only the beginning. By the time the capital moved to Meroë, the Kushites had become major players in the iron trade. Those industrial-scale smelting sites at Meroë weren't just for domestic tools. They supplied iron goods throughout sub-Saharan Africa and into Mediterranean trade networks. In a world transitioning from bronze to iron, Kush held the keys to the future. Iron tools, weapons, and raw materials became a cornerstone of their economic power. Their greatest strength, however, was their role in international trade. The Kushites positioned themselves as the middlemen between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean world. Kushite craftsmen carved ivory. Kushite handlers trained exotic animals for elite buyers, and their merchants understood what different markets wanted. This made them indispensable in a global supply chain that stretched from Rome to India. Let's not overlook agriculture. Despite being located in an often arid environment, the Kushites developed sophisticated farming systems. They mastered irrigation along the Nile and in drier regions. They used innovative dry farming and seasonal floodplain agriculture. These surpluses didn't just feed their population, they sustained a labor force of builders, miners, soldiers. Their economy could support monumental construction, military campaigns, and a growing urban population. Even more impressive, they managed all of this across political shifts in the Mediterranean world. Whether Egypt was ruled by Persians, Greeks, or Romans, the Kushites adapted. Their commercial networks didn't collapse, they evolved. Archaeological finds include Roman glassware, Chinese silk, Indian beads, and other international luxuries, often in quantities that suggest direct contact. It's not just trade through intermediaries. Their economic model was brilliantly hybrid, both local and international. They kept African trade routes alive while integrating into global commerce, and that economic foundation. It's built on resource control, industrial output, and commercial savvy. It's what allowed the Kingdom of Kush to survive and thrive for over a millennium. Like every empire in history, even the Kushites would eventually face challenges that wealth alone couldn't solve. Every great civilization has its end. And for the Kingdom of Kush, that ending didn't come from one cataclysmic collapse. It came from a perfect storm of challenges that even their centuries of resilience couldn't overcome. The unraveling began with something that sounds almost mundane: environmental change. But make no mistake, it was devastating. Around the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, the climate in the region began to shift dramatically. The Nile River, which had been the lifeblood of Kushite civilization for over 1,000 years, began changing course and altering its flood patterns. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was a crisis. The intricate irrigation systems that had supported agriculture became ineffective. Trade routes that once followed the predictable Nile were disrupted. Cities that had thrived on river access suddenly found themselves isolated and struggling to survive. Meanwhile, the Sahara was becoming even more arid. Land that had once supported farming and herding was turning into desert. This sparked migrations, competition for resources, regional instability that made life in Kush more difficult by the year. But the climate wasn't their only problem to the southeast. A rising regional power was getting stronger: the Kingdom of Aksum, located in what's now Ethiopia and Eritrea. While Kush controlled inland trade along the Nile, Aksum controlled the Red Sea port sand that was becoming the future of commerce. As Roman and Byzantine merchants focused more on maritime routes, they found it faster, easier, and more profitable to deal directly with Aksumite ports instead of relying on Kushite. That shift was economically catastrophic for Kush. For centuries, their wealth had depended on taxing and managing overland trade. As that trade rerouted through Aksum, Kush's economic engine stalled. At the same time, political fractures were forming inside the kingdom. After nearly 1,400 years of rule, the Kushite monarchy began experiencing succession disputes and internal strife. Power struggles drained resources, weakened the state, and distracted leaders from addressing the larger crises brewing around them. While all this was happening, the military landscape was also shifting. The Kushite military, once famous for its expert archers and knowledge of desert warfare, found itself outmatched by Aksumite armies that were using new tactics and weaponry. Kush's traditional advantages didn't hold up against this new kind of warfare. But the final blow may have come not from swords, but from faith. As Christianity spread across the region, especially with Aksum's conversion in the 4th century CE, diplomatic alliances began to shift. The Aksumites built strong ties with the Christian Byzantine Empire, while the Kushites held on to their traditional religious systems. That decision left them increasingly isolated politically, culturally, and economically. By the time Aksumite forces conquered Meroë around 350 CE, the Kingdom of Kush was already a shadow of its former self. Once mighty empire had been weakened by decades of climate stress, trade collapse, internal power struggles, and diplomatic isolation. Yet it's important to say this clearly: Kush didn't fall because it failed. It fell because the world around it changed faster than even a brilliant, adaptive civilization could respond. For over 1,400 years, the Kingdom of Kush was one of the most enduring powers of the ancient world. It survived Egypt's might, held its own against Rome, and shaped African and Mediterranean history in ways most people today don't realize. Its fall wasn't the end of African greatness. It was the closing of one chapter in a much longer story of African empires, kingdoms, and civilizations that would rise in its place. Because if there's one thing the history of Kush teaches us, it's this: Africa has always been powerful. Africa has always mattered, and the Kingdom of Kush proved that to the world. The legacy of the Kingdom of Kush stretches far beyond the deserts of ancient Nubia. At a time when Egypt was fractured and vulnerable, It was the Kushites' black African ruler, who revived and preserved Egyptian culture, architecture, and religious traditions. They didn't just imitate Egypt. They safeguarded its identity during one of its darkest periods. Their influence didn't stop at the Nile. Kushite ideas in governance, art, and military strategy filtered into other African civilizations. Their mastery of ironworking, for instance, may have accelerated technological shifts across the continent, and today challenges outdated assumptions about African history, forces scholars and the public alike to confront the reality that Africa was not on the margins of world history, it was central to it. In modern Sudan, Kushite heritage is a source of national pride. And across the diaspora, the Black Pharaohs have become powerful symbols of African agency, resilience, and cultural sophistication. The story of Kush reshapes how we see the past and how we understand Africa's place in it. If this journey stirred something in you, curiosity, wonder, a sense of awe, consider subscribing, leaving a comment, or sharing this with someone who might appreciate the forgotten brilliance of ancient Africa. There are countless more histories waiting in the silence. Until next time, good night and sleep well.